Newfoundland here is only a recent addition to Canada, having joined it in 1949. Yet Canada was confederated in 1867, and so the two remained divided for nearly a century, which raises a pretty obvious question. Why? Why did it take so long for Newfoundland to join Canada? So, when the colonies which would become Canada were debating confederation in 1864, politicians in Newfoundland began to discuss the issue at home. Did they want to be a part of this new Canada and take their rightful place in the world, or just sit on the sidelines and watch history pass them by? Turns out the sidelines were just fine, and Newfoundland would sit this Canada thing out. Their primary reasons were that 1. Whilst the politicians there were largely pro-confederation, the people were most certainly not. Which brings us on to reason number 2, Catholics. Specifically, French Catholics, who made up a sizable chunk of this new Canada's population and thus had a lot of influence. And the people of Newfoundland, proud Protestants that they were having none of that. And the third reason was economic. Newfoundland had low taxes, and there were concerns that a new central government in Ottawa would raise them to pay for things like railways and a national military. So what changed? Well, Newfoundland continued to develop on its own, and its people, for the most part, still wished to remain independent. There was a very sudden change of heart in 1895 when the Newfoundland Premier, William Whiteway, made a plea to join the Confederation. And this was totally because they loved Canada and nothing to do with the massive financial crisis that had just hit them. The Canadians said no, and so they were left to struggle on with mountains of debt. After this, the people of Newfoundland were still against Confederation, and in 1907 Newfoundland was promoted from a colony to a dominion, meaning that its continued independence seemed assured. And its history largely mirrored those of the other dominions throughout the early 20th century. There were reforms at home, political scandals, World War I, greater exploitation of natural resources, and a general improvement in the economic situation. That was at least until the Great Depression, which could only mean one thing: pain. Newfoundland was essentially bankrupted by this, and so it went for the previous tactic of trying to sell itself to Canada. The Canadians said no because it sounded expensive, and the British refused to help unless Newfoundland suspended its government and let them run it instead, which they did in 1934, and the British took over before proceeding to also be terrible at running the place. So in World War II, the British negotiated away basing rights to the United States in return for some much needed ships, and the Americans began massive investment in the area. This drastically improved the living standards of the people living there, and after the war many people demanded that British rule come to an end, which meant it was time for a referendum. The people had two choices: go back to being independent or remain under British control. The first option terrified the British because it would have meant Newfoundland increasing its ties with the United States, and there were some there even advocating for statehood. This option also terrified the Canadians because with these borders, Canada's access to the Atlantic could be restricted, and along with it, Britain's access to Canadian resources. And so, to stop this potential outcome from happening, the British and Canadians teamed up to add a third option to the ballot: join Canada. Now, the representatives of Newfoundland didn't want this option, but that's not how British rule worked, and so on the ballot it went. The referendum was held in 1948, and whichever option gained 50% of the vote, that would be the action taken. But none of them won, and so a second referendum, this time without the potential to continue British rule, was held, and union with Canada won with 52% of the vote. And after some negotiations, Newfoundland ceased to exist as a nation and became a part of Canada the next year. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching, with a special thanks to my patrons: James Bisonet, Kelly Moneymaker, Alex Schwinn, Mr. Wolfe, Captain Psydog, Adam Stalter, Sky Chappelle, Marvin Cassow, Aaron the White, Mo, James Castaneda, Jordan Longley, Jerry Landen, Gustav Swan, Rashid Ali, Winston Kaywood, Boogly Woogly, Spinning Three Plates, Copper Tone, Maggie Paxkowski, Spencer Lightfoot, Matthew Shipley, Robert Wetzel, Corsho Wolf, The Muck Whopper, Anthony Beckett, Marcus Arsner, Lil Brep and TC, and Charles the First.